Great. Well, we'd love to welcome a special guest, a good friend of ours. A pastor to our church, the district minister of our conference, the British Columbia Baptist Conference, the BC, Bernard Mukwavi. And we've been working on this for about, a month and a half, Bernard, probably. But as many of you know, he's a wanted man. He's wanted in every church to speak at all times, in all seasons, in all months, in all weeks. We're lucky enough to get him this morning, blessed, in fact. And Bernard, we welcome you now, and to share some of the things that you're on your heart about this season, about race, about injustice, and as well encourage us as a church in transition. We are so grateful to have you, and welcome to Uptown.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, everybody, for having me. It's good to be with you this morning. I've been looking forward to this day when we can share together from God's Word. The title that I have for the message today is Loving God. And you might find it interesting that I chose this title when I was being asked to talk about issues to do with justice and race, or injustice and racism. I could not find any other title that would best describe what I have to share with you today except this one. We continue to pray for you at Uptown as you transition in your leadership. We are praying that God will guide you in every situation and through the process. We are grateful to Steve Whitmer and for the associate pastors at the church, and the elders and the board at the church as you work together as a congregation. You have been working together, going through transition at an interesting time. Interesting in the sense that just when you began to do this, then COVID hit. So you've had to make adjustment for the times of meeting and the way you do church. And I want to thank you for what you're doing. And then in the midst of this, we have this social upheaval, which really, the one we're experiencing now, even though it has been happening for many, many years, but the killing of George Floyd, I believe, on May 2025, turned the world upside down. It has changed the way we look at things and has brought certain conversations again onto the surface for discussions, and these conversations are proving to be very uncomfortable for some people, and some people politicize these conversations, and some people are trying to look at this as since it's a political issue, the church should not get involved. So I have been asked a lot of questions during this time. I don't have a lot of time to address those concerns and questions, but I think the church leadership is trying to find out prayerfully if they can have a time when we can have a panel and have a discussion as a family. In fact, I was able to do this with one church last Sunday, and that went very well. But I'm going to read from Matthew chapter 22, verse 34 to verse 40. And this is going to be the text that I'll be speaking from. I'm going to bring other scriptures as well, so that we have an understanding of the message. Verse 34 reads, "Hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, the Pharisees got together. One of them, an expert in the law, tested him with this question: 'Teacher, what is the greatest commandment in the law?' Jesus replied, 'Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind.'" Now I want you to take note. It's like complete, with all, everything. 38, "This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it. love your neighbor as yourself. Verse 40 explains to you why I have chosen this to be the theme for my message today. Because it says, all the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. And that means everything else that you talk about will actually hang on these. So as a way of introduction, I like to say the topic that I've chosen to share with you today relates to love for God and love for other human beings. Again, take note, other human beings is what I'm calling neighbor. We will seek to define love and talk about how love for God and how love for other people really looks like. What does it mean to love God? And how does that look like? What does it mean to love other human beings? And how does that look like? And all this will be discussed in the context of Jesus' encounter with two groups of Jewish religious leaders. Know that it's leaders who are religious. We can draw lessons from this encounter on how we understand the greatest commandment from God, which is agape, meaning unconditional love. And this love is directed to God and to his people. Now, as I discuss this with you, I like you to know that I'm talking about this in the context of what's going on with regards to injustice and racism. So I'd like to define these terms very quickly so that you know the premise from which I speak, and then you understand how I'm using these terms. So when I use the term justice, I'm talking about being fair, like in the court system or the policing system, or in the way we relate to other people, even in other institutions. I'm talking about being fair. You know, when you do the right thing, when you are fair, you do not treat one person different from another. So there's a sense of justice in the courts when you're passing judgments, or when you are arresting people, or when you are guiding people. The opposite of justice is injustice. And these are cases where some people have not been treated with justice. In fact, somebody gives an example from King Ahab in the Bible one time when he wanted to buy land from one of his subjects, and that man refused to sell him land because it belonged to his lineage, to his family, and he wanted it to be passed to his children. And King Ahab goes back to his wife Jezebel looking very sad. He was dejected. He was frustrated and disappointed, and the wife asked him why he was so sad. And he explained what was happening, and the woman goes there and does some injustice to this man that actually takes him out so that they can get the land. Because they were in a position of power, they could do that. So that's what we mean when we talk about injustice. It's using our power in order to get what we want from other people and to treat them in a wrongful way. And then when we talk about race and racism, I like to mention that many people have had trouble trying to define what race is. Recently, I discussed on a panel, I think this was on Friday, regarding this whole idea of race. I have had trouble finding it in the Bible. People have asked me questions like, Bernard, where do all the different races come from? And I've been asked this question, I think, for close to 40 years. I have never found an answer to this question. I've not even found anyone else who has an answer to this question in the way that I'm going to explain it to you. Some people have tried to use various theories to try and describe what race is and where race originates from. And all those are simply theories. What I have found the Bible teaches about one species of human beings, not several species of human beings. So the Bible talks about God creating humans in his image, and he created them, and he said it was beautiful, it was good. And he created them in this way, coming from one man, and he created people, and we grow differently, and some people are tall, some people are short, some people get bigger, some people don't get that big. They're slim, thin, whatever you want to say. Some people have dark hair, some people have blonde, red, brown, you name it. Some people have different, in fact, people have different types of skin tones. But inside, when you look at the biological studies of human beings, genetically, they are not really different from one another. If they are, it would be a very, very minute fraction, maybe 0.0 something, because you find that even people from within the same racial background, there will be some of these variations or differences that are there. So race was used in the past to refer to people's regions or languages. Like in Europe, you would have the English race and the Irish race and the Dutch race and the German race. And people use that to refer to people who spoke different languages, but their skin color was probably the same. But then later on, through the centuries, people began to refer to race in regards to the differences in the physical features of people. That was not the original one that was discussed before. And when you read the scriptures, the Bible actually just talks about people's geographies. People lived in different places, but they still had interactions. They even intermarried. Even in the line of Christ himself, we see marrying across his family line, and we hear stories of Ruth and also Rahab. But we also know the story of Moses, who had married a Midianite, and they called a Cushite, and there's a lot of debate there. When you read Numbers chapter 12, you see that his brother Aaron and his sister Miriam got into trouble with God because they actually began to discriminate against this woman that Moses had married, because she was a Cushite. Now, Cush could refer to parts of North Africa, or could refer to that part of Midian where he had gone. But there was interactions of people in that area, and people actually did intermarry. And we know the story of Abraham himself, who fathered a child with Hagar. So we have people that really interacted across the differences that would have been language and also physical. There's a story of Queen Sheba, the queen of Ethiopia, who traveled to go see Solomon, and Solomon ended up fathering children with her. And if you know the story of Ethiopia, you actually have black Jews. These are black Jews who were airlifted from Ethiopia during a famine in Ethiopia and taken to Israel. So when you go to Israel right now, you will find Jews who are black, really black. They look like me. I have been to Israel with my wife, and I did actually find them. They are Jews, and they practice everything there, and they trace their ancestry to Solomon. So there was this interaction there at that time. So what is racism? You see, racism is actually a combination of prejudice, uh, discrimination, uh, that we put together. So prejudice is when you really judge people before you get to know them. You draw conclusions based on what you have heard from others, and you stereotype those people. So when you look at racism, there's prejudice, stereotyping, and discrimination. Because you have made conclusions about certain people, you stereotype them, and you paint them with one brush, and then you exclude them from participating in certain events or certain jobs or social groupings that you have. And so what is systemic racism? Systemic racism then is when racism has become so pervasive that we can hardly recognize it because it has become part of us. It is no longer just within the system. It's beyond just the policies that sometimes are developed. It is part of the culture. It has become a way of life. So it is so pervasive that you don't even notice that it exists because it has become part of you. Therefore, systemic racism can be experienced and practiced by all people groups, whether they are white or black or brown or yellow, whoever they are. So it can become systemic, and because it is evil. And there are powers that are behind this that seek to divide and to destroy, that seek to destroy God's creation. Paul fought hard against systemic racism, injustice, and prejudice. We see that one time he confronted Peter, the apostle, and he writes this in Galatians chapter 2, that when Peter was in Antioch with the non-Jews, he was hanging out with everybody, eating with them and having fellowship with them in a normal way. When some people came from the church in Jerusalem where Peter was from, then Peter started to withdraw from these people who were different from him, who spoke a different language, who were of a different so-called race. And he behaved as though those people were dogs, because this is how they treated them, like people you shouldn't eat with, even shake hands with. And so he withdrew to such an extent that he misled Barnabas. And this incensed Paul to the point that he rebuked Peter openly in the presence of everybody, because what he was doing was not right. And that shows you why and how we need to stand against injustice, against racism, against systemic racism. I have been asked questions on the relationship between the gospel and social justice. Let me tell you this. I am very surprised when people ask me this question, because I do not like to politicize this discussion. When we want to understand what we as a church need to be preaching as the gospel, we need to listen to the preaching of Christ. We need to read the Old Testament, which informs the New Testament, because the New Testament is the fulfillment of the Old Testament. The reason the nation of Israel was punished, one of it, because they disobeyed God and they did not follow what he had commanded them to do, what we will see later. So the gospel cannot be separated from social justice. If it were, you would not have Luke chapter 4, verse 18, where Jesus says, "The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is upon me, for the Lord God has anointed me to preach good news to the poor." And he talks about opening the blind eyes and setting the captives free. It tells us the story of the Good Samaritan. And I just wanted to give you this background, kind of extending my introduction so you know the premise from which I am speaking. It becomes very important for us to realize that as Christians, we are not guided by politics or culture. We should transcend politics and culture and preach the message of Christ as it is given to us in the Bible. So we need to look at the scriptures and ask ourselves, what does the Bible teach about these things, instead of choosing to live within our own cultural confines. And so it's everybody. Some of you are aware that I have served on the African continent, the European continent, the Asian continent, and the North American continent. So I speak with that understanding of some of these things from my own studies and research on these continents, but from my own experiences. And that's the reason I told myself I would transcend my own cultural biases and obey the message of Christ to take the gospel to all people. So this is a short narrative that I wanted to give you. In the passage of scripture that we read, in verse 34, it talks about Jesus' dealings with religious leaders. You see, when Jesus was preaching the message that he came to preach, the message of the kingdom, he disrupted the social structures and ways of doing things. This frustrated and angered many people, especially religious leaders. I need to emphasize that religious leaders were the most frustrated ones. It was not your ordinary people, but it was people that found their way to the temple, people that went to the synagogue, who were frustrated with Jesus, who were angered by Jesus because of his ways of doing things, because it challenged their authority, it challenged their systems. So when you think about what's going on today, we have the COVID-19, and then we have the social upheaval that has brought the whole discussion of racial issues and social issues. 20 years from now, 50 years from now, people are not going to remember COVID-19 the way they're going to remember the social upheavals and what is happening right now. Just like during the civil rights movement, people remember the civil rights movement more than they remember many other things. Roads have been named after civil rights leaders, just like right now, roads in the United States and other places are being named after George Floyd. And this is incensing some people who are saying he was not a martyr, he was a bad person, he was a drug addict, he was a gang leader. They're trying to paint all these names, but that is falling on deaf ears. So that what side of history are you and I going to find ourselves on? During the civil rights movement in the 60s, in the 50s, when people were marching, some religious leaders chose not to march with Martin Luther King Jr. because they didn't want to identify themselves with him. Even big names, some of them names that I respect, and I've been very disappointed as I study history to see that they actually would segregate people when they go to these stadiums to listen to the gospel of Christ. There were all these black people that came to listen to the message that was being preached, and yet in the crusades, they could not sit together with the white community. There were ropes that were put to say this is the black only sitting area, this is the whites only. One of those preachers was Billy Graham, sometimes who had to tolerate those, and one time it frustrated him so much that he got off the stage and he went and ripped off the ropes, and he said there is no separation between black and white. And so I have great respect for Billy Graham, one of the men that has inspired my life. But he worked during such a time that was very, very difficult. And he had a large following. He spoke to thousands and thousands of people. And sometimes it was difficult for him to understand what Martin Luther King Jr. was doing, because Martin Luther King Jr. used to march on the streets to demonstrate for the rights of people. And the complexity came in because Billy Graham had to find out what he needed to do to obey the law or to get involved in civil disobedience. So you have these two giants who were championing the cause of Christ and who had different methods of doing this. So you and I are living at this time where you were going to find some Christians who are rising up and speaking up against injustice. And I hope you'll be found on the right side of history. What are you going to do? What are you going to do? It is not just Black people that we're talking about. We are talking about the indigenous peoples, the First Nations of Canada. What do we do? I tell you what, we all come from a history that not all of us are proud of. All of us. I have not found a people group all over the world that are proud of their history. Every people group has some stain in their history, whether there are groups in Africa, groups in Asia, groups in Europe, and groups in North America. We are now trying to rewrite history, and I've been saying to myself, you cannot change history, but you can change the future. So these religious leaders, going back to them, they were used to leading lives in a certain way and doing things in a certain way. And Jesus comes, when you read in Matthew chapter 21, you read verse 12 and verse 23, he had an encounter then which began after he drove out the money changers and their customers from the temple, where he said, my house should be called the house of prayer. Both the Sadducees and the Pharisees were so mad at Jesus that they planned to trap Jesus through the questions that they had set up for him. They wanted to see what he was going to say so that they could trap him. And one of the questions they asked him was, by what authority do you do what you're doing? Who gives you this authority? It's interesting. These are creatures. These are created beings. They did not realize that they're actually challenging the Creator himself, unless you don't believe that Jesus is God. Can you imagine? They are Christian people. Let me not call them Christian. They were religious people who were to be missionaries of the message of the one they are challenging. But they had twisted this message to fit within their own cultural biases. They had created a religion that was not what they were given to proclaim or practice. They questioned him over and over, and he gave them answers in parables. One time the Sadducees had asked him a question with regard to the resurrection. They did not believe in the resurrection. Jesus answered this question perfectly well, so well that they just had to go so embarrassed and step away from him. Then the Pharisees thought they were smarter than the Sadducees. They got together to pick up from where the Sadducees had left off. And they were to ask Jesus a question from their own religious belief. They picked one top lawyer who could defend their belief. In verse 35 to 36, here's the question. What was the question that they asked him? Here's the question. One of them, an expert in the law, tested him with this question. Teacher. First he called him teacher to recognize him as a rabbi. However, the plan was to trap him in his answer. And he says, which is the greatest commandment in the law? Why was this question given? He wants to trap him. You see, they themselves, as Pharisees, follow this. They believed that they were righteous people. They followed the law to the letter. They practiced a religion of doing everything that was required according to what they had established as the law. So the whole idea was to justify themselves as Pharisees that they were in fact doing the right thing. And they knew that Jesus was going to give an answer that would actually trap him, and they could use that to arrest him and to condemn him. Let's look at the answer. That's your third point there, the answer. Jesus gives the answer. It is found in verse 37 to verse 40. And Jesus gave the answer in two parts. Look at the first part. Love the Lord your God. And this is taken from Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 5. This first part here, when you get it from Deuteronomy, it says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength." So with all your heart, your innermost being, your spiritual part, and with all your soul and with all your mind, really, when you talk about this, you're talking about the entire you being surrendered in your worship of God. You make God as number one in your life. You are dependent on him. You recognize him as your creator, as your sustainer. He's the one that gives you life and everything that you need. So your love for him actually is an expression of greatness, a gratefulness to him, sorry. So you are grateful to him as you respond. And he says, this is the first and greatest commandment. If it is the first and greatest, looking at greatest, that means there's nothing that can be greater than the greatest. It is loving God with everything about you. I want you to notice something. And this is where Bible scholars sometimes will have trouble what Jesus is doing. Because the first part says, love the Lord your God, and it just says everything that I've told you from Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 5. And then the second part in the answer, it says, the second part is like it. What you don't know is that he's actually saying the second part is just on this equal footing as the first part. I never saw this in the past, because I could not bring myself to comparing these two. But it says the first part here is on equal footing as the second part, because it says the second part is like it. Love your neighbor. It gets it from Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18. And I want you to see what Leviticus actually said in full. It says, do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against anyone among your people, but love your neighbor as yourself. Now look in your heart as an individual. So do not take revenge. I'm pretty sure you and I have been offended before by other people. We have carried grudges, probably. I don't want to ask you to raise your hand or identify yourself. I know in my own heart that some people have done me harm or said things that frustrated me, upset me, angered me, to the point that had I been careful, I would have carried a grudge and resentment. But he says, do not seek revenge. Do not bear a grudge against anyone. Did you see that it says, do not take revenge against anyone? Do not carry a grudge against anyone? Anyone simply means anyone. But love your neighbor as yourself. How do you love your neighbor as yourself? We are going to really look at this closely, how you love your neighbor as yourself. But as we go further, in order to understand this, I'm going to take you to Amos chapter 5, and we are going to read verse 21 and up to 24. The acceptable expression of true religion. And I'd like you to know that the Pharisees had presented themselves to Christ as religious people, as people that followed the law, as people that were righteous. And what he's telling them through this explanation is actually they missed the point. They had broken the law. Here is how. If you do not practice justice and righteousness, you have broken the law. In verse 21, it says, let's go, yeah, you can go back to that slide that you went to. When Amos prophesied to the nation of Israel, God said through him that, I hate, I despise your religious festivals. Your assemblies are a stench to me. Oh no. When we read this, we might think, oh, these Jews, they were a stench to God. And we think we are righteous in our time as a church. Listen to what he tells them in verse 22. He says, even though you bring me burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. So they actually brought offerings. They gave tithes and offerings like we do in our churches. It says, though you bring choice fellowship offerings, I will have no regard for them. Oh, verse 23 says, away with the noise of your songs. They thought they were worshiping, and God says, you're noisy. I will not listen to the music of your harps. He was not interested in their offerings. He was not interested in their music. He was not interested in their raising of their hands and their dancing and their falling prostrate to the ground and their offerings. He was not interested. And when you read this coming from your own human mind, you might say, God, what's wrong with you? These people love you. Look at the offerings they bring to you. Look at the music. Look at the words they say to you. Look at all the wonderful things they do. He says, no, he was not interested because these people had failed in one area. What was that? It was in the area of justice and righteousness. It says in verse 24, but let justice roll on like a river. What does it mean? When you read Isaiah chapter 58 and Isaiah chapter 59, you will see that he had told them that they were actually disobeying him by the injustices that they practiced against other people. They did not protect the vulnerable. They did not protect the orphans who had no one to protect them. They did not protect the women amongst them who were widows, who were so powerless that people took advantage of them. They did not protect them. And guess who else they did not protect? They did not protect the wanderer, the immigrant, the refugees in their midst, because he wanted them to provide shelter for them. That was part of their requirement. They were to look after the aliens amongst them. They discriminated against people of other lands. That was injustice. And also, when you read the whole chapter of Amos chapter 5, you will see that, they had moved justice into bitterness because they practiced injustice. So he tells them, you want to make me happy? You want to worship me? Let justice roll on like a river. Do not stop justice from going on. You see, this is a river that never gets dry. You never get tired of justice. You need to practice justice. Be fair to other human beings. Make people of all races, all backgrounds, both genders feel they're protected and they're cared for and they're loved. Any church that stands on the wrong side of justice is actually working against God's plan and disobeying God. And then it says, righteousness like a never-ending stream. We need to be right. We need to do things right. We need to stand by righteousness. If you are walking down the street, you see somebody being beat, being killed, you do nothing. You are standing on the wrong side of justice. You can never close your eyes to injustice. When we read our histories and we see how we have practiced injustices, the best thing that we do as human beings is to recognize that we've been wrong. Even if we are not the ones that did it, even if it was our ancestors who did that. When I read my family history, I find some things I'm not happy with. I say, God, I am so sorry for the sins of my people, my fathers. May you forgive me. May you forgive us. May you help us to make things right. That's where we begin. So how do you love your neighbor the way you love yourself? Let's go to the next slide. It tells us in Matthew chapter 7 and verse 12. It says, so in everything, take note, everything, not some things, everything. Do to others what you would have them do to you. For this sums up the law and the prophets. Does this sound familiar? You know, it says the prophets and the law hang on these. So in everything, do to others what you'd have them do to you. How would you want other people treated? That's how you should treat others. Living in Regina, some of you may not know Regina, Saskatchewan. I would drive in the inner city, and sometimes I see people who are overcome by drugs or alcohol. I remember one time coming from a graduation at our Bible school and driving with my wife, and I saw one man who was really overcome by alcohol, and I stopped and I said to my wife, this is God's creation. This is God's child. God loves this man the same way he loves us. The fact that somebody is addicted to something does not make them less human. And I say that because I noticed within our city, Regina, Saskatchewan, there was systemic racism, the way the First Nations people were treated. And that really made me think that we need to change. As a church, I saw systemic racism in churches as I traveled. One time we went to a festival in the city and different people were making presentations. And there was one area where the First Nations were actually beating their drums and dancing. And one of our church leaders that I was working with just turned around and says, that's demonic. In the name of Jesus, I rebuke that. And I thought to myself, who gives this man the right to think other people's drum beating is really demonic? And our guitars are not demonic? I don't know if you really understand what I'm trying to say here, but my friend had passed judgment on all people, and that was really wrong. Instead of building a bridge with the people, it had become them and us. And the more people did that, the more the First Nations retreated and wanted to identify with what they could worship as a God who accepts them. I had to go and take a team of students to a First Nations reserve in Saskatchewan. And it was a team of all white young people that I had to go with. So I was told that, well, it's a very dangerous place and you'll be killed there. The shooting, the police are called there, there's violence. So I went with my students and we had the most wonderful experience. We stayed with one man who owned the restaurant. This was the white man who had married the First Nations woman, and they lived there. They owned the restaurant, and we stayed with them. We worked at the restaurant, and then we went on the streets and mingled with the people. And none of us was shot by anyone. And when I went from house to house sharing the gospel, they opened the door for me, and we just had a very good time. And it was it was wonderful. And this is what I say when I talk about some of these things, and some of these are very difficult conversations to have. But from my experience, God gave me very beautiful First Nations children that called me Papa B. And our church began to grow. And when you go to the church we went to now, it's multi-ethnic church, and it's pastored by this lovely friend of mine. He's a Caucasian white person. Of course, I have to use these terms to try and make a point. And he loves people, and the place has been growing. The church, when we were there, was about 300. Now there are over 800 people growing and very multi-ethnic. Verse 40 says, all the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. It's impossible to disentangle and separate the love for God and the love for human beings. You cannot separate the love for God and the love for human beings. These are intertwined. So you cannot say you love God and not love human beings. The only way, and please listen to this, and this has been my discovery in my research and interaction with people. The only way you can treat people in a way that is different from what God requires of us is when you dehumanize them. That's the only way. You have to dehumanize them in the same way that the blacks were dehumanized during slavery in North America and in the Caribbean and also in Europe. They had to be thought of to be subhuman or to not be human, to such an extent that we are so embarrassed to talk about what our people did by our people, because Christians participated in this, where they would get a group of black people, men and women, and they would breed them like animals, like dogs, for sale. You have to dehumanize people in order to treat them like that. That is the only way you can do that. We have such a taint in our history that we don't want to think about. It's uncomfortable to talk about this. We cringe. I do cringe to talk about some of the things that have been done in many parts of the world. Africans have done that to one another. Asians have done that to one another. Europeans have done that to one another. So this is global pandemic, really, in the way we have treated one another. Guess what disappointed me? Again, as I did my research when I lived in Europe, it was to find that churches and other groups would hold conferences in which they had to define what it means to be a woman, whether a woman was a human being or subhuman. I'm talking about a white woman. A conference held to say, is the woman at the same level as a man? Is she a human being? What is the difference between a woman and a cow? So I'm sitting in the library there in Amsterdam and I'm going, what? How can you think like that? Now, when I share these things with you, you might also be reacting in the same way that I'm reacting, to say, why would people think like that? Unfortunately, that's the history that you and I come from. We cannot do anything about the past. We can do something about the future. In 1 John chapter 4, verse 19 to 21, as I close this conversation, I like to read this. Let's see, maybe you don't have that, or maybe you do. I'm reading from 1 John chapter 4, verse 19 to 21. Maybe you don't have this. If you don't have, I'll read it. You just refer to it. People can read in their own Bibles. It's 1 John chapter 4, verse 19 to 21 says, we love because he first loved us. Whoever claims to love God, yet hates a brother or sister, is a liar. For whoever does not love their brother and sister whom they have seen cannot love God, whom they have not seen. And he has given us this command: anyone who loves God must also love his brother and sister. Just as I'm reading this, I am thinking to myself, how can you compare a woman to a cow? Then you don't love women. We never like to talk about some of these things. And that's why a woman those days later in Europe could not vote. Even here in Canada, it was not long ago that women got the freedom to vote. I'm talking about white women. She could not hold a bank account. She could not have children put on a passport. Brothers and sisters, in the same way that we have treated women, we have treated other people that look different from us, but we have also treated prisoners in the same way, whether they look like us or not. But I like to say that religion and ethics are intertwined. You cannot separate your religious practices from your ethics and morals. They go together. Now, the love that we're talking about, it is not an intense emotion, but a sacrificial commitment to God and to our neighbor. Take note of what I mean. You don't feel it in you. You don't feel the love, you choose to love. And it is also sacrificial when you commit to God and to our neighbor. You commit. During apartheid in South Africa, some of you have heard of Nelson Mandela, but you have never heard of many other people who were of East Indian origin, who were white people that walked side by side with Mandela and fought to dismantle apartheid. It was a group thing, a team thing. And when you listen to their Truth and Reconciliation, you see that white people rose up and said, no, I am not going to go along with apartheid. And some of them were killed. Some of them lost their jobs. Some of them lost their income because they chose to stand on the right side of history. During the civil rights movement of Martin Luther King Jr., there were white people that rose up and marched with him. Also, we may not hear a lot of these things. During the collapse of colonialism in different parts that were colonized by the British, there were people that stood up and said, no, we will not stand for injustice. It reminds me of the words of Jesus that you and I should practice in John chapter 15 and verse 13. Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. In conclusion, Jesus shows us how to fulfill the law and the prophets. Our religious commitment or service should flow from our intimate relationship with God. We do not perform our duties to be noticed by people. We should serve out of love and commitment to God and to our neighbor. The neighbor is to be loved and treated as one loves and treats oneself. May God bless you as you continue to think about piety, which is your religious commitment, and your ethics, which is how you treat other people. God bless you.
Mm. Mm. Thank you. Thank you, Bernard, for sharing with us today. It's so powerful, so moving to hear you share in your heart like that and provide us such a biblical perspective on this very profound issue. And I'm going to invite us to stay together as a group. We're not going to go into our typical breakouts like we would on a Sunday. And Bernard has graciously agreed to stay with us for a bit longer and to respond to any questions you might have. Can I suggest that you would, as a matter of kind of structure and providing an orderly way to do this, If you have questions, would you just click on the chat function and personally send those to Chris or to Sarah? And they'll act as our MCs as we walk through this next few moments of time with Bernard. Thank you. My goodness, I'm so moved. I'm going to give you a second here, everyone, to just think of a question. But I do want to just reflect as I kind of wrap this incredible sermon. Bernard actually read from Amos chapter 5, verses about 17 to 21. This was the section I read this morning in my personal time with the Lord. Justice, let justice roll like a mighty river, let righteousness like a never-failing stream. This morning in my journal, I wrote specifically around this concept of righteousness like a never-failing stream. Just one very simple thought. The concept, the imagery here is that our righteousness, the righteousness that you and I display, that may it not be like a seasonal stream that flows in the spring when there's lots of water, then the heat of summer, it dries up. And the thing that so powerfully impacted me, and I journaled about this morning, was that I wanted my life to be consistent, that righteousness for me would not dry up in the heat of the moment when it became a point where I had to sacrifice or when something was being tested. May I not go dry, but may my righteousness continue to flow like a never failing stream in every circumstance. So I'd be consistent, I'd be dependable, I would be authentic in all my actions and my behaviors. And that's the same prayer I have for all of us here at Uptown, that our lives, our righteousness would be never failing stream of God's grace and love and mercy and compassion, and that we would respond as God would have us, loving God and loving our neighbors as ourselves. I'm going to hand it over to Chris and Sarah right now and to field some of your questions from the floor here, and Bernard's going to respond to those. Thank you so much again, Bernard. Thank you for your incredible message to us this morning.
Yeah, thank you very much, Steve.